Welcome everyone to today's Revolutionizing Healthcare session. We will talk about what data do I need. We have on the last session already talked a lot about tools that clinicians could use that make use of machine learning and AI. And today we go a little bit deeper, see, okay, what kind of data do I need for it? What kind of data can we provide through these tools? We will start with an introduction by Mihaela, and then we'll go straight into the conversations with our clinicians, some of which have some of their own data and their own work cases brought with them that will show to us. And then Andrew will take everyone into a panel discussion. There will be at the end time for questions as usual. If you have questions that come up throughout the session, just put them into the chat and Andrew will call you up at the end of the discussion to put your questions and your opinions forward to our panel, which all consists of revolutionary clinicians like yourself. We invited everyone today who is on the panel to join us, and thankfully we got some very exciting minds to share their insights.
What I'd like to start with is a few key concepts and a few key questions that I often hear from my clinical collaborators, and I want to present the questions, provide a few tools that I think are useful to think about answering the questions, and then return to the questions at the very end. So often the following questions come when we are discussing about building clinical machine learning tools. How much data do I need to do machine learning in the medical setting that I'm interested in or in my clinic? Another question is, what would be the quality of the data? And even, how do I know what's the quality of my data? And can machine learning improve the quality of the data that I have? And what happens if I do not have enough data for which the outcome of interest is known? Could I use not only the data that is of high quality and is labeled, but could I use additional data that I have to improve my predictive model or to to improve the analysis that I plan to do? Can I share the data that I have without fears that privacy breaches are happening as a result of that? And we have talked in our sessions last year about synthetic data as being an opportunity to deal with that. And maybe more generally, what is the difference between cross-sectional data, treatment data, time series data, and how to think about these different data sets if it is to embark in developing clinical machine learning? So the challenges, of course, associated with data are numerous, and here are just some of them. One is, of course, the data quality is often not perfect. Data may be noisy. There may be errors in the data. We may have both features as well as what we call labels, which are outcome of patients that may be ambiguous or even erroneously labeled. Also, the data is often not necessarily collected, for instance, in electronic health records or even clinical registries, for the purpose of doing analytics. Instead, it was gathered for other purposes. So this data collection process often introduces biases, and this is something that needs to be considered when building robust machine learning models. Also, there may be quite a lot of missing data, and some of this data may be missing at random. Some, though, may be informatively missing. And these are important considerations when thinking about the data we have. Hence, systematic data curation is crucial to ensure model reliability. And this is not only for machine learning. This is also true for epidemiological model or biostatistical models. So everything I'm going to talk about today is not only a challenge for machine learning, it's a challenge to do any analysis of high quality, whether it's with machine learning or with statistical methods or epidemiological models. And dealing with challenges that are related to the quality, the bias, or the missingness of data are hard problems. And what we want to do today is both to understand some of these challenges, to understand how machine learning can cope with them, but also, wonderfully, machine learning can help improve and deal with these challenges, even if you don't want to build machine learning models as an analytic. You may be able to use machine learning models to just help with the quality of the data and the accuracy of it, and then use potentially a biostatistical model or an epidemiological model to do your analysis. Even that is possible. And really, the role of data is really crucial in informing model training for machine learning and beyond. And in order to be able to rigorously test these clinical analytics, we need really to move potentially beyond what I call benchmarking style, where the model is evaluated on a held out test set and assessed on average or aggregate performance. We may be able to do better and stress test these models, whether it's machine learning models or statistical models, even more powerfully, and be able to identify in what settings we can apply these machine learning models or statistical models effectively. And hence, there are opportunities to think beyond just the conventional way in which we train models and validate them within a cohort of interest, and try to understand how they can translate to other cohorts in other hospitals, in other countries, in other populations. And again, this is important for all clinical models, not only machine learning models. And it's not only useful, this is not only useful at training time and at testing time, but also importantly at deployment time. What type of data will I have at the time of deployment? It may be that I trained and tested this model in a data set that was quite clean, or conversely, that had a certain type of bias. Will the data at deployment time suffer from different errors, different biases, different noises? How to prepare for that? And also, when do we really know that the data we are now feeding from our model is not anymore relevant, and hence the models may need to be retrained or may start to have different types of uncertainties. These are all issues associated with data curation. Not data curation at the time at which you train and develop these models, but rather later when they are deployed. And again, these considerations are important for all clinical models, not only machine learning models. So I'd like to introduce 4 key concepts to deal with these issues. First is the concept of data-centric AI or data-centric ML, which is an emerging paradigm in machine learning. And I think it will be very useful to think in the context of this paradigm for the initial questions that I posed at the beginning of the presentation. Then I'm just very briefly reminding you about synthetic data, and that's a topic and a technology that uses machine learning that we discussed last year, but I'd like just very briefly to bring it to the foreground. I also would like to tell you a few things about self and semi-supervised learning, which represent cutting-edge machine learning models that we are using today, but which are very useful because they are able to learn not only from data that has the outcome of interest, but potentially other data sets that you may have that are related, but not exactly about the cohort of interest. And finally, I'm going to talk about the scenario when we have just very few data, but we may have access to expert models, either from pharmacology or from epidemiology. How can machine learning join forces with these expert models to learn from limited data? So let us begin. This data-centric AI aims really to give data center stage, and it is a different paradigm than the conventional machine learning paradigm, which just focuses on using the data available to train machine learning models. In this new paradigm, we aim to use machine learning to systematically improve the quality of the data that we have. So machine learning is used here purely to improve the quality of the data we have access to. And then we can decide whether we want to use a machine learning model or a statistical model to do analysis on. And unlike this area of data-centric AI and machine learning has emerged relatively recently, but unlike other researchers in machine learning, we have defined this data-centric AI to be much more encompassing and enable us to think holistically about building end-to-end machine learning pipelines. So we define this area as being encompassing methods and tools to systematically characterize the data, evaluate the quality of the data, as well as generate the underlying data used to train and evaluate models. And this means that the machine learning pipelines, at the machine learning pipeline level, the consideration at each stage should be informed in a data-driven way. And hence we apply this data-centric lens to keep a sharp focus on the data rather than ignoring the machine learning model. So we have developed for that an entire pipeline, and you see here the role of data and the role of machine learning to improve the quality of the data at various stages. The first stage, which I'm going to call the data, involves considerations to improve the quality of the data used for model training, such as proactive data selection. What data do I want to select for my analysis? Data curation, as well as data cleaning. Then at the training time, when I want to train a particular predictive analytic, for instance, autoprognosis, which we discussed in previous sessions, considerations are based on understanding the data to improve the model training, such as, for instance, data-informed model design or model adaptation, as well as robust training. At testing time, when we want to test our model, considerations around novel data-centric methods to test machine learning models, such as, for instance, how shall we split the data for testing purposes? How shall we come up with targeted metrics and stress tests and evaluation of subgroups, such that we know that the machine learning model or the statistical model that has been trained is indeed performing well, not only on the average population, but also of subgroups of interest, males versus females, diabetics versus not, young versus elderly. And then at deployment time, machine learning models, data-centric machine learning models that enable us to deal with data post-deployment. For instance, as we have a particular model or an analysis that has been done, when do we need to retrain the model because the data may have shifted? For instance, in COVID, that was a very big problem because models have been trained on one particular data set at the beginning of the pandemic, but then as the pandemic evolved, the population has evolved. When do we really need to retrain the model? And how certain we are that the model is going to perform well for the data at hand? All of this are representing important considerations for which machine learning can bring a lot to bear. So we can use machine learning to enable all these four boxes to operate more efficiently. Today, I do not plan to go through them, but if you are interested to learn what machine learning can do with respect to these four items, I invite you to take a look at the research pillar we have on our website that discusses this at length, and we call this the data-centric AI research pillar. An important area within this data-centric AI is data imputation, and I want to make this as a particular point to talk about, because most data sets you use for analysis or to build analytics contain data that is missing, either missing at random or missing informatively. And usually in the statistical and clinical work, there are a variety of statistical methods that have been used for a very long time, but many of these methods are no longer state-of-the-art. And what I want to draw your attention is significant progress that has happened in machine learning over the last 5 to 7 years, where machine learning has significantly improved the performance of imputation methods as opposed to statistical methods. And the reason this is relevant is because now we can deal with quite a lot of missing data and are able to impute correctly even in the presence of a lot of missing data. And methods have also been developed to deal and learn from data that is not missing at random. And if you want to learn more about that, you can look at our big idea piece that focuses on data imputation. And we have an open source package that represents state-of-the-art in machine learning data imputation that's called HyperImpute. HyperImpute is part of autoprognosis, but it can also be used as a standalone data imputation paradigm. Let me now talk a little bit about synthetic data. And we have had last year in the spring a session about synthetic data where I, together with a few clinical experts, have discussed the power of synthetic data in healthcare. I will not repeat most of what was said there, but I want to remind you that synthetic data can deal with a lot of data imperfections. Please note, synthetic data is not just de-identified data. While de-identifying data, anonymizing data, is just removing the fields that are sensitive. Synthetic data is data that's based on real data that's created from scratch, and not only has the advantage that provides privacy, let's say, preserving properties, so no longer you can identify back who was the original individual. But what's good about synthetic data is that it can provide a whole set of tools to improve the quality of the data you have. And how do we create synthetic data? This is a very vibrant field in machine learning. We often call this field generative modeling. And synthetic data is really using cutting-edge machine learning models to generate such data. And this is useful not only to share the data with a colleague, for instance, due to privacy considerations, but synthetic data could also be used for you internally, even if you don't want to share it with anyone, just to improve the quality of the data you have. I will say a few words about that. But if you want to read more generally some things about synthetic data, again, I would invite you to take a look at the research pillar we have on our website that is dedicated to synthetic data. What I want to talk in the context of the discussion today is the fact that the synthetic data is capable to fix a lot of real issues associated with real data. For instance, if the data has a certain type of biases, it can enable us to debias the data. So if the data was, for instance, biased in a particular way for a particular population or subpopulation, we can use synthetic data to debias the real data. Even more interestingly, in some settings, if we have data that doesn't contain patients of a particular type, or a particular characteristic, we have only a small sample size for a subpopulation, we may be able to use synthetic data to augment the real data for this subpopulation of interest. Also, we can learn from various domains. So we can have data in different countries, in different subpopulations, and yet we can put them together and create a data set that's larger and more representative than all these different data sets alone by creating synthetic data on the basis of transfer learning and domain adaptation. Also, as I mentioned before, we often want to have data models that are future-proof. That if the data is changing, for instance, we are going to see more patients with a particular comorbidity present in the data set going forward, or if we expect that younger patients are going to need to be treated with a particular treatment, we can create this data, even if this data is not available today, by using synthetic data on the basis of a variety of real data sets and create the populations of interest for the future. And if you are interested in playing with synthetic data, probably not necessarily all of you may want to play with synthetic data, but if you want to learn more about these technologies, we have released an open source software that's all encompassing, and we call this open source software SynCity. and you can use it to improve the quality of your data in the way I mentioned, and provides really libraries for all these innovative uses of data improvement. And finally, the reason we feel this is important is you can use technology like SynCity, which is an open source technology, to bring it within your own ecosystem, clinical ecosystem, and use it to give access to improved quality of data. Let me now move to another topic, the topic of self and semi-supervised learning. As we know, labeled data is often limited and expensive. So often clinicians come to me with a data set that is wonderful, but it's very limited in size. And machine learning is really not very able to deal with such a situation. On the other hand, you often have data sets at hand that may not have labeling of the outcome of interest. And often it is much easier for you to acquire a variety of related data sets that may not have the outcome of interest. Utilizing those unlabeled data sets is critical in scenarios where you have limited data. And the way we are able to deal with this is through the concept of self-supervised learning, which is a very important paradigm in machine learning. It's a relatively recent paradigm in machine learning, and it is used for processing unlabeled data to obtain useful representations that can help with whatever task of interest we want in the future. For instance, building better predictive analytics, or looking at whether certain variables of interest are indeed causal. And usually in the typical self-supervised learning pipeline, we have this, what we usually do, we are learning supervisory signals, which are nothing else than relationships between the unlabeled data. And in this way, we can create representations that are very powerful, such that when you append to it the limited data you have that is labeled through a concept of semi-supervised learning, we are able to learn effectively. So these ideas of self and semi-supervised learning are really very new paradigms in machine learning that utilize not only the limited labeled data, but also the largely available unlabeled data that you may have. And this is again important because in many settings, you may only have a limited data of interest, and you may use these auxiliary data sets that may be in related populations to empower and transfer knowledge to the limited data sets that you have. And if you want to learn more about these concepts of self-supervised learning, semi-supervised learning, multi-view learning, again, I invite you to take a look at our website where we compile a set of resources. This has been a very successful paradigm for imaging, and it is our lab that has introduced technology on self-supervised learning for tabular clinical data. And we show significant success, for instance, of using that, for instance, for genomic data, and in particular, building polygenic risk scores. Another idea that you can use when you do not have enough data is to use expert models. And what expert models I have in mind here? The field of pharmacology is full of wonderful models. Whether it's from pharmacology or more generally from other fields such as epidemiology, we have a high quality set of expert models that have been tested within the laboratory. The problem with these models is that at times they may be incorrect, misspecified, incomplete, or they may be one size fits all. So they are not there for a particular patient, but rather for a set of patients. And what machine learning can do to deal with these issues associated with expert modeling is use the limited data that you have available to combine the expert models and the machine learning models together through a concept that we recently introduced and we call hybridization. In this way, the field of machine learning model doesn't need to deal just with the limited available data. Machine learning is not very good to learn from limited data, as you very well know. But if these machine learning models are empowered with powerful existing knowledge, for instance, in the form of expert models that come from fields such as pharmacology, the marriage of these two ideas is quite powerful. And again, one particular example that you have seen in a past session where we used pharmacological models and machine learning models to really do precision dosing in the ICU. And this is work that we have presented in a previous session together with two clinicians, Lucas Fleur and Paul Elbers, and it shows the power of this hybridization. And I think much more can be done. So let us now return in the last 3 minutes to the key questions. How much data do I need to do machine learning in the medical setting of my interest? Well, first, it clearly depends on the problem at hand. What do you really want to choose? Do you want to validate or invalidate a hypothesis? Do you want to build a predictive analytic like autoprognosis? What is really the goal? The answer will really depend on that. But it also will depend on the accuracy and trustworthiness you want to provide associated with these methods. The more data you have, the tighter will be the confidence estimates associated with your prediction. You can also use, as I mentioned, synthetic data to allow you to transfer data from various other domains to enrich the data set at hand. Also, through the process of synthetic data augmentation, we may be able to really create additional relevant data such that we can enrich the real data and hence improve the performance of the predictive analytic for a subpopulation of interest. Through the concepts of self-supervision, we can leverage not only labeled data of high quality, but a variety of data sets that are related to that as well. And again, this represents cutting edge in machine learning as well. And finally, by using expert models from other fields, whether it's pharmacology, whether it's epidemiology, or even clinical models, they could be hybridized with machine learning models such that we can use the available data to really deal with personalization of these expert models to the population of interest, and also dealing with model misspecification of these expert models in the population of interest. What should be the quality of the data? How do I test the quality of the data? And can machine learning improve the quality of my data? The answer to that is this new field of data-centric AI. And we have actually built, if you are going to look at the data-centric AI pillar on our website, and we will provide you with some additional resources in the email that will follow this session, we have a tool that we call DC Check, which allows you to really assess the quality of your data through a variety of machine learning methods. And this is a very powerful tool to understand really how good is your data even before you start and embark on an analysis. Also, that could tell you something about what additional data can you collect. So if you are in the process of data collection, you don't want to spend a lot of time and money till you ask this question. You want to use these tools ongoing. As you are ongoing and you are gathering more data, whether it's in a clinical trial or a particular registry, you want to have access to these machine learning tools to keep assess the quality of your data. Also, tools like missing data imputation and more generally the field of synthetic data can improve the quality of the data that you have. Then what happens if I don't have enough labeled data? I mentioned both self-supervised and semi-supervised learning, as well as the expert models being empowered by machine learning. And can I share the data without privacy fears? I would say in that area, the world of synthetic data has made progress, but I think still quite a lot needs to happen to be able to guarantee that the data is shared without privacy considerations. So right now, I would almost advocate the use of synthetic data, not for the reasons of sharing, but rather to improve and increase the sample efficiency of the data that you already have. So use synthetic data for this novel, innovative use where synthetic data improves the quality of the real data you have. And finally, there are, of course, differences between cross-sectional static data that you may use to build, for instance, prognostic scores or diagnostic tools like autoprognosis. If you have treatments, then of course we move into the complex setting of causal effect inference and individualized treatment effects. And we have talked a little bit about that in past sessions, but then the questions that you can ask if you have treatments can be really quite different, and the type and quality of data you may want is also depending on the questions you may want to ask. And finally, if you have time series longitudinal data, one may need to assess the quality of the data for the purpose at hand. Do you want to understand trajectories of disease? Do you want to make forecasts on how a particular patient will evolve? Or do you want to use machine learning to identify disease early in a new population? Hopefully this provides a view of what is possible in terms of machine learning to improve the quality of the data we have.
Mihaela, thank you. That was done with your customary tour de force of many of the issues anyway, associated with data in a clinical setting. And I think it sets us up really well for our panel discussion, which of course Mihaela will be participate in. But we're also joined by four clinical experts. We have Professor Carsten Niemann of Copenhagen University. We have Dr. Janak Gunatilleke, who's head of healthcare data and analytics at KPMG. We have Dr. Mustafa Khanbhai of Imperial College, and we have Dr. Nazima Pathan of Cambridge University in the UK. So delighted that you've all been able to join us. I hope you've been as inspired by Mihaela's overview of kind of where the cutting edge of these issues are for machine learning, in particular in healthcare. And what I'd like to do is to ask each of you in turn just to talk a little bit about your perspective on the issue of data for machine learning. So much is often spent on the model and not so much time spent talking about the data. And I'd like to start with Carsten, if I may. And I know, Carsten, you've got a couple of slides to share as well. So perhaps you can share your perspective on this through your slides, if you'd like to share screen.
I'll try to give like my perspective on coming from a clinical setting, developing clinical trials, and collecting a quite large cohort of patients with different lymphoid cancers. I'm a hematologist working in hematological cancers. And what I want to emphasize is that we started out actually with a biobank just from our institution, 700 patients. Now we grew to 65,000 patients, biological samples from 10,000 of those. But we and others have several times demonstrated that just looking at omics data, genetic data, would not benefit the patients that much. Actually, we published last year that adding the routine data from the time series that Mihaela very nicely mentioned, that is actually the medical real life, that we do not care about cross-sectional data, we only care about data over time. And wanting to link all the omics data to these numbers of different data that you see here coming together. And this actually represents what we have today at our National Genomics Center, a cohort of more than 60,000 patients, where you see to the left the data coming directly from the electronic health record. And you see on the upper part data from the nationwide registries that we have in Denmark. It is a nationwide cohort. And to the right, you see the specific quality databases and hematological registers where we collect data from. But obviously, we need to standardize these data. We are collaborating with a number of other health data scientists on what's called the OMAP standardization, but it's ridiculously large job to keep track of all our data to make sure we can actually standardize them. And that's why I really like the idea of self or semi automatized learning algorithms to actually benefit from these diverse data that we have across the different institutions. So I might go as far as to say to Mihaela and to the rest of the machine learning community that I want it all and I want it now. So I think that should be the best motivation for you actually to address the questions and what we really need.
Thanks, Carsten. That's a great challenge. Let me move to Janak now. Janak, I mean, you come from it from a different angle, I suspect, and a different set of experiences. Do you want to share your take on this? I imagine in your world, these issues around data are very, very real and play really front of mind for you.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. Yeah, and I think, as you say, for me, one of the key things is around, how to sort of do things at scale and how to do things across many organizations. And what I see from my work with kind of several NHS organizations is that, everybody wants to do the cutting edge stuff, wants to do AI, but the reality is a lot of NHS organizations are still at the stage where they're relying on descriptive analytics, which is where they're looking at events that have happened in the past. There may be like a PowerPoint presentation or a PDF document of saying, okay, 2 weeks ago, this particular thing happened. They want to move to be able to forecast. They want to be able to move to more cutting edge technologies, including machine learning. And I think one of the things that I often sort of end up working with various organizations is around some of the foundations that are needed to be able to move towards more sort of advanced analytics. And those things could be around addressing some of the challenges around data being in different systems, in different formats. How do you bring all of that data together into one platform, and how do you use the latest cloud-based technologies in terms of collating, analyzing, and sharing that data? And some of the things around governance, Mihaela talked about some of the concerns around privacy and sharing of data. So I think those are some of the key aspects that we need to have in place in terms of the right people being able to access the right data at the right time without it taking weeks or months to be able to do that. I think one of the other key areas that I see is around the kind of the readiness of the workforce and the users to be able to work with ML-based and AI-based solutions. So do they have the right skills and the confidence to be able to kind of work with and interpret and do something with the insights coming out of the solutions? So those are some of the areas that I see from a kind of a wider scale implementation perspective.
Yeah, that's really interesting, Janak. So even when the technology is in place, and even when, frankly, you clean the data, potentially there are governance and training and the various issues one has in making those things a reality in a complex setting. So there's Carsten's challenge of I want it all now is a very big one, not just technologically. And Mustafa, do you want to share your perspective? Obviously, you come at this from a very interesting angle. Do you want to share how you think about these data issues in a clinical setting?
Yeah, absolutely. So my work is around natural language processing and looking at patient feedback data. So in the NHS, we collect over 1 million pieces of feedback nationally as part of patients' experience of the care that they receive. Unfortunately, as you're probably all aware, that this, although it's mandated, the data doesn't get looked at, it sits somewhere in the ether. And, it's unethical. We're asking patients to give us their feedback, but doing nothing about it. So we created sort of a natural language processing model using supervised machine learning to try and just understand and try and unpick some of the themes and sentiments that come out of the data from the patient's perspective. As you probably know, we don't have enough patient experience or patient feedback resources. There are a maximum of 2 people within the patient experience team. Expecting them to troll through thousands and thousands of patient feedback in real time, so it's actionable in real time, is almost impossible. And it's a challenge that exists and continues to exist with most NHS trusts. So we're really trying to change the narrative around patient experience data and using that almost as a marker of patient care and patient quality. And what we're really trying to understand is how can we triangulate the patient experience data with other metrics. We know that care quality is part of patient safety, patient effectiveness, which is done really well in most NHS trusts. But patient experience is always treated as the sort of, poor relative of care quality dimensions. So it's really trying to triangulate the data to tell a story. And it sort of brings back to Janak's point around changing the culture around patient experience as well. So it's not about moaning patients, but actually that they're able to provide rich insights that can actually change the trajectory of patient care and the way that quality care is delivered, and also improve the care. So it's really trying to establish qualitative data, giving it a more quantitative structured format with natural language processing, machine learning, and then using quantitative data from an effectiveness and safety angle to triangulate that, to really provide a true picture of patient experience, and then doing that in real time. So it's a challenge that we're still working on, but we've worked with other trusts as part of the Paddington Life Sciences digital collaboration space with the Health Foundation to really try and unpick some of that and evaluate how it can be sustainable in the long run as well.
Thanks, Mustafa. I think it's a very good, timely reminder that it's not just about sort of direct clinical data, that actually, whether it's operational data or experience data, and simply collecting the data and thinking our job is done is not necessarily, it's just really just the start. So it's certainly an area that the lab works very hard at, is data beyond the clinical data as well. And I know it's something that Mihaela feels very strongly about. So thank you. That's a wonderful perspective to extend our conversation. And finally, and Nazima, you come at this very much from the coalface. I know when you contributed to one of our previous sessions, it really brought home to me just the as I say, the environment in which ML needs to operate. What's your perspective on it from a data perspective? You looked at it from a skills perspective last time we spoke. What about it from a data perspective?
So from my perspective and clinical perspective, I work in the intensive care environment in the paediatric sort of population. Issues, I think, from a data perspective are, first of all, trying to look at quite a heterogeneous population. And I think one of the questions, in fact, is similar about where some hospitals may have certain types of rare and complex disorders. They're important, but often how do we generalize our data? That's an issue. Patients being very dynamic in how their responses are. We have a very rich data environment, both in terms of, as with Carsten, we in my group, we're looking at both the bedside and electronic data from their health record, but also doing blood sequencing and sampling from their various compartments, lung, microbiome, gut. And so there's a potential for being able to predict both deterioration. So my interests are, can we use, mainly I'm interested in time series data, can we use it to predict acute deterioration? And we've started looking at models to predict acute deterioration in terms of organ failures, defining organ failures or of mortality risk in this population. And then other things, of course, can we look at developing predictive factors to help us guide therapy, such as the risk of an infection, needs to start and stop antibiotics in a population where often standard tests are not conclusive and therapy is over cautious. Perhaps we could improve that sort of judiciousness of our therapy.
Thanks, Nazima. Again, it's very coalface and therefore very, very valuable perspective. We've had a question that's come in over Zoom, so please do ask your questions on the chat function. And I'm just going to ask Mark Wainwright. Mark, if you're still with us, just to unmute yourself and put on your camera if you've got a camera with you, and just share your question.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. Thanks for such a fascinating discussion. I'm thinking back to Dr. Schaar's comment that models should be reliable under a variety of conditions. I'm speaking as a pediatric neurologist at a academic medical center in the US with a particular interest in PT or critical care. So in that context, at academic centers, as I think the last panelist was just acknowledging too, one of the key conditions is this, the center at which a patient's being taken care of. Academic centers, as you all know, tend to have complex patients with rare disorders, even if, and so there can be, if you take that rarity, combine that with the subtle variations in care, which we think are consistent, but still vary in ways we don't fully keep track of across academic medical centers. How do you keep that level of consistency that in a way that can allow the generalization of a machine learning model? Put another way, a model which is effective at one center, in my question, I guess particularly academic centers, may not be effective, reliable at another center because the conditions vary in ways which are unpredictable. Thanks.
Thanks, Mark. It's a great and important question. Mihaela, I know you have a strong view on this one.
Yeah, so thank you, Mark, very much for this billion-dollar question. I'd like to ask you to maybe reach out, and we should try to put together a piece to answer your question together, because I'd be keen to hear your thoughts and your response to mine. So I have 4 different, and I'm going to try to be brief. So first, of course, what we should try to do is make sure that if we train a model on one type of population, indeed will generalize to another population of interest. And for that, we need to have not only uncertainty estimates associated with our model, but also, like you rightly say, we may need to test our models before giving them to the public to use in other scenarios under various types of scenarios. So one thing is to train a model and deploy it in the same population. Something else is to deploy it on a totally different type of population. And this is where machine learning, I think, can help, not only at the model development stage, but also to generate data with the shifts and drifts and characteristics of interest. Number 2, I think that it's an enormous opportunity to learn from different centers with different types of characteristics, and not only look at the data as data, but like you rightly said, the data was collected by clinicians with different levels of expertise, potentially, different types of insurance ecosystems. So all these different forces are overlaid on the data that you are training a model on. And I think machine learning can do a lot to both debias the data sets, but also to learn from expertise that exists in academic centers and empower clinicians in other centers that may not have access to the same resources, and understand the value of different types of data that you may have in an academic hospital because of the resources you have, and technology that may not be available at another hospital. So that's another issue. And maybe finally, what I didn't talk a lot about, but that increasingly the machine learning community can build for you and together with you technology that really, if you like, using reinforcement is this emerging area of reinforcement learning, but for data improvement, where one could say, I have now a patient with a particular characteristic that that I've never seen before. Can I send this patient to a colleague or to a machine learning model that has been trained on that sees usually this type of patient? So this is not really about only at times about having data locally. It's also about finding the right data that was similar and applied models that have been trained, or expertise from a clinician that has been seen on that data.
Great, I agree. Thank you.
That's a really interesting perspective. One of the things that you've been very clear on and spoken at length in your introduction, and again there, is about synthetic data, data imputation, reinforcement learning to improve data quality. I just wanted to ask our panel whether or not, how close you feel we are to being able to use synthetic data in a clinical setting. You know, Mihaela's talking about that this is technology that is there today. There are already open source tools for doing that. Carsten, can we start with you? I mean, are you using any of these sorts of techniques today on your data sets to improve your data sets?
So we're not using it to improve our data set. We're using it for teaching purposes. I'm teaching or the course director for part of a master in personalized medicine. And we wanted to make it as research-based as possible, and thus also using some of the methods from Mihaela's group. We created synthetic data set based on our original data set. I'm constantly challenging Mihaela and other data scientists to actually improve the methods, especially for time series data. And I would really not like you to stop just with augmenting or improving our data quality, because we really need the synthetic data, and we have actually developed a legal document that is in the last steps to be approved on when we can release a synthetic data set publicly to use it freely for education, but also for competitions where we can actually benchmark models trained on the synthetic data set towards the original data set. So I'm using it as soon as the methods are developed, because we desperately need it to improve our modeling on real clinical data.
That's great, thank you. And Janak, I mean, are you seeing it at all, synthetic data in the NHS settings that you were talking about?
Yeah, I think we're starting to see, some applications in sort of selected areas. I think one of the kind of really interesting areas for the application of synthetic data could be around the kind of early innovation stage, by which I mean, if, for example, if you're a startup with an interesting idea, or you want to try something out quickly, at the moment, it takes a lot of time, because for correct reasons, it takes time to go through the governance process to get access to data. But if you look at some of the other industry, like the finance industry, where banking or insurance, opening up data sets actually created a lot of innovation on top of this. I know it's not as easy to do that with actual patient data. So I think that's where synthetic data can actually mean that, okay, it's almost a safe environment where innovators can actually almost have a play in terms of, they've got this idea, does it work, does it not? As a sort of an initial almost a sense check. So I think there are conversations going on about sort of using synthetic data to sort of open up access more widely and sort of at a lower level of governance. So I think that's a really interesting and exciting area that for me personally.
Thanks, Janak. And I think we're running very short of time, but I just want to take, because I think it probably asks a question that a number of you are asking. I just want to ask JB Wollard to just unmute, if you will, and just ask your question, because I think it asked the question about which meant the sort of the magic of synthetic data. Well, how do you know, if I've understood you correctly, is it good enough to use? Have I understood your question correctly?
Yes, exactly. You can develop a wonderful algorithm for you. And when do you think we are able to share it with colleagues and to use it? That's the follow of the question previously asked is when do you consider that you can use your algorithm and you think it's generalizable? It's a question of validity of and generalizability of an algorithm.
So Carsten, please, you have a perspective on this.
So we have actually implemented an algorithm into our electronic health record system, and we've done it by what's called a medical device regulation. It considered it a grade 2A algorithm. And the reason I want to mention this algorithm that we already implemented is because we have to monitor the performance over time. So for me to release it into our electronic health record system, we requested that it was robust, meaning that it both performed in an independent test set from our local registry or our local EHR data, and in an independent external cohort from a German clinical trial, collected in a totally different environment, as mentioned also here, with different physicians, with different traditions, and actually missing whole classes of data and still performing. And then the next step is to have an ongoing monitoring of the performance. We spent actually 1.5 years remapping all research data into production in the electronic health record system, and we want to automatize that process. But we also make sure to actually monitor over time that we do not see drift or biases in the performance. We trained it before the COVID pandemic. We've just submitted an abstract on how it performs during the COVID pandemic, taking out or accepting to include COVID infections. It's predicting infections. So we need to take all these steps into account, and I actually think it's better addressed by the medical device regulation than by the CE labeling, which is mandatory if you implement that across different health record systems. So, and we're working on describing this in a paper we hope to publish later this year.
Well, thank you, Carsten. I'm sure we all look forward to seeing that. It's certainly a key part of the reality-centric agenda, is the fact that the world continues to change. We're out of time today, unfortunately. The conversation I can see is kind of just getting going. So I'll be speaking to Mihaela about whether or not we can schedule another session on data, because it's such an important area, I think. And if you'd like to we very much welcome your feedback. So do put something in the chat now, or drop an email in response to one of the emails that Andreas and Mihaela send out if you would like to hear more on data, because I do think it's an area that we could helpfully cover for at least one more Revolutionizing Healthcare session. And then with any luck, we'll get to hear more from our panelists then as well. In the meantime, I'd like to thank them all for taking time out to come and share their expertise, and for all of you for coming along. Thanks very much, everyone.